We come now to the population mix of Afghanistan, the size of the country and the intermixing of these groups. I gather the difficulties in Afghan history in centralizing the country are not the sectarian splits between Sunni and Shia Islam, but rather between the different ethnic backgrounds of the tribes and how those interact, and in the period that we'll come to talking about the post-Soviet Civil War, the post-Soviet War, Civil War,
right.
The conflict between militias essentially based in ethnic groups. What has that factor been, and how large is the country in terms of population?
Afghanistan's population today is probably around 25 million. There hasn't been a census, a full census done, and in fact, in many ways, there was never a full census done. The population estimated at the time of the Soviet invasion was about 18 million. And Afghanistan is a plurality. There is no majority ethnic group. The Pashtuns, who have traditionally dominated at least the highest levels of government, make up about 42% of the population. The next largest group are Tajik or Persian speakers. And they probably make up somewhere around 25% of the population. And then you have smaller groups, the Hazaras, who are predominantly Shia, the Uzbeks, and the Turkmen in the north. And these groups have at times lived peacefully together, and there's a huge amount of intermixing in Afghanistan's major cities, in Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, Herat in the west, Kabul in the east, that are very mixed cities. But the administration of Afghanistan has been largely in Pashtun hands. The king was always Pashtun. And so there was some division that in different periods did often cause tensions, either because certain groups were not given enough of a role in the government, or one of the things that previous kings did in order to try and expand the writ of government and their control over Afghanistan was in fact to give lands in non-Pashtun parts of the country to Pashtuns and sort of force tribes to move into those different areas to try and cede their control throughout the country, which of course has caused tensions to this day between populations who found themselves in provinces surrounded by other ethnic groups and having found tensions between those groups as a result.
So that this issue of tribal rivalries and balance of power among tribal groups clearly extends back into Afghanistan's history, but let's bring it more up to date. You have a royal system with a king up to the 1970s, I believe. And all of a sudden, with the pressure from the Soviet Union then to the north, its republics that were traditional neighbors and even population feeders into Afghanistan, something changes. How can we begin to track the transformation of Afghanistan's history and the entry of modern politics and modern warfare, if you will, into the Afghan countryside?
There are a few dramatic steps. In 1973, the king, who had been king for almost 40 years because he took over very young, was deposed by his first cousin, Daoud, who tried to create a republic. And this was at a time of intense Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union around the world, but particularly in Afghanistan. And at this time, politics really first sort of started to become relevant in Afghanistan. In 1978, then, there was a communist coup. There was supposed to be a period of democratization and liberalization that went off the rails in the 1970s. And as a result, the parties that began to form, leftist parties, Islamist parties, became extremist because they weren't actually part of the governing system. And when the Soviet Union first supported these groups that created the coup in 1978 and then invaded in 1979, you had an intensive process of radicalization of the Afghans, both into communism and into Islamist parties. The Soviet invasion then triggered something much more geopolitical in this conflict. So this was something that was happening in Afghanistan and had international relevance, but the Soviet invasion galvanized the world one way or another. And you had a process of enormous investment of military resources into Afghanistan, both by the Soviets, who not only invaded the country and brought their troops and mechanized units and all of the sort of modern military that the Soviets had to bring in, but at the same time, you had Saudi Arabia, China, Egypt, and most notably the United States starting to support financially and militarily these Islamist parties that grew up. One of the most significant things that happened in that period is that the parties that formed, the Mujahideen parties that formed to fight the Soviet Union, were often ethnically based because they were based around particular personalities who came from a particular area. There was no national Mujahideen party. And when that happened, you started to have this sort of clannishness or ethnicization of the Afghan conflict because all of these parties, these armed parties, were really operating in particular parts of the country, and they were very atomized.